Yeah, so I'm excited to sort of close with this because I think as we've talked all day, an undercurrent that I hear more and more is this idea of education. And not, education big E or formal E or thinking about formal education even, but just general education. What does it mean to be an educated person on the subject of intellectual property? So I'm super excited to have this amazing panel up here from a wide variety of backgrounds. We have policy, we have education, we have industry up here. And so IP really sits at the center of innovation. I think we can all agree on that. We've talked about that a lot today, but it is often misunderstood. We know that there is an anti-IP movement out there. And so what we want to talk about today is how we talk about IP and how are we framing this narrative and thinking of it as really something that can be a tool for empowerment and creativity, something that benefits individuals and not just corporations, or thinking about it as something for profit. And so we are fortunate to have a panel here from that entire ecosystem to have this conversation. So we're going to start with a general question and then we'll get deeper, but we'll start with this one. So from your vantage point, and especially as AI reshapes how we create and innovate, do you think it is reinforcing negative perceptions and stereotypes of IP or creating an opportunity to reframe its value?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Simpson. I'm the Chief Policy Officer at Council for Innovation Promotion, and really thrilled to be here today. Before that, I was on the Hill in a couple different capacities, and before that at the PTO. So I've seen this from a couple different perspectives. And I think AI is presenting a lot of new energy around the IP debate. And it's definitely going to force some interesting and difficult questions. And my hope is that this will be an opportunity to more generally get people, especially on the Hill, who might not need to, on a day-to-day basis, address IP issues, to realize that it actually affects them probably much more directly than they think, and use that as an opportunity to engage them in more education. So I think maybe most prominently what we've seen with copyright and AI kind of making headlines, making it apparent that that this is something that really affects everyone, and I hope more people will get involved because we need a lot of people thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. Corey Salsberg. I'm Global Head of IP Affairs with Novartis. We are a leading innovative medicines company. So I come at this from the pharma perspective, so I can be the punching bag if you want. But also, I think throughout this panel, also share a much broader perspective on IP, because we see all IP as very similar, actually, in more ways than many people will admit. To your question, I mean, I think absolutely, I'm very optimistic that AI actually will make our job easier in explaining IP to people and why it matters. I think what we really need to do in order to do that is meet people where they are and to try to connect dots for them as to how IP relates to their everyday experiences, their everyday wants and needs. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that later, but just a couple of points that I'd make in opening that I think are really important to hit and to convince people of. One is, we've talked, and I've heard a lot of the panels today talking about how AI is going to democratize innovation and creativity, and there's no doubt about that. It's already doing that. The obvious way I think that we can get to people is, as more people that previously were just users of IP are now becoming developers and producers of IP, that is a direct interest that we absolutely have an opportunity to harness and to point out that I think, Sarah, maybe it was in you and I when we were doing our prep session, you talked about how, everybody with an iPhone is a creator because all you have to do is push your button on your phone and you're a copyright owner. So AI, of course, expands that dramatically. So that's one point. Second point is, I think we really need to educate people that, to remind people, but particularly with AI, that using third-party IP that belongs to others, is not a victimless crime. ultimately it's going to take away the very things that the people using that IP value, right, in the next generation of content creators, all that. And then the third thing, which also came up in our interesting discussion session before this, was the role of NIL and those other types of IP rights that we hadn't traditionally thought of that are a big issue because of AI. The way I like to think about it is, even if you don't plan to use AI will certainly use you. It will use your, potentially your name, image, likeness. Even if it doesn't do that, if you're not a big sports star, it will use your personal data, your online presence, and your copyrighted content that you've created. So that is another way to point out how important IP rights are, kind of from the flip side.
Hi, everyone. I am Arlyne Simon. I am an AI systems architect at Intel in the Health and Life Sciences division. And I'm also a writer. I write the Abby Invents picture book series. And so in my day job at Intel, as an AI system architect, I am leveraging my background in biomedical engineering. So I work at the intersection of imaging, AI, as well as computing hardware. And as a children's writer, I'm using children's books as a launch point for introducing kids to IP and the engineering design process in a pretty fun and engaging way. So to answer Sarah's question about, my vantage point, I have a dual lens on AI, first as a sort of a creator or advancing healthcare AI diagnostics. And then also as a storyteller, having more of being more on the consumer end of Gen AI applications. So as a technologist, it's very easy to see the benefits of AI, particularly in diagnostics. Like, of course, I would love my radiologist to have an AI application that helps her quickly figure out if I have a tumor. And as a storyteller, I see the risks. We've spoken a lot earlier today about copyright law, and the risks for creatives is really that with AI companies sort of training Gen AI models on copyrighted work, then that means the output of these Gen AI models are competing with creators. And so we are all here as innovators. And so the problem that we want to solve is how do we manage, how do we coexist as creatives in this space of AI? We've heard discussions earlier about potentially having licensing plays. And what I think is that every time a new technology is introduced, we sort of go through the forming, storming, norming, performing stages. And, with the forming stage, we're already here. AI is here to stay. I feel personally we're sort of like in the storming stage. There's a camp of us who are really excited. There's also a camp who's very anxious about it. And just as we had, when the music industry sort of entered the streaming platform, where we were able to see creatives and technology coexisting, just as we have guardrails with the food industry, where now when you enter your grocery store, you can feel safe actually getting food and not feeling like you're going to be poisoned or you're going to be sick. In the clinical trials that we have for drugs, you have these regulations in place to make sure that before the drug gets to the market, it's past a level of rigor so you can feel assured. I think the same thing is needed in AI, just to make sure that before these AI models are produced, that we have that level of safety. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great way to start this conversation. And just to talk a little bit about what Corey said, when we think about barriers to entry or accessibility to anything, and in this case, thinking about IP or AI for that matter, we think of it as moving from novelty to utility. I think the sooner you can move from having people think of something as novel, not in the patent sense, of course, but it's moving from novel to being actually useful, then we can work with young people to help them learn to become creators of something and not just consumers of something. Which is why when I tend to talk to younger people, especially elementary and middle school students about IP, the first question I always ask the room is, who in the room has intellectual property? Who in the room has a copyright? And yeah, it's interesting. This room, everyone should raise their hand. I would be shocked if you did not. But with younger people, no one raises their hand. And then I ask the question, well, who's written a poem? Who's written song lyrics? Who's taken a photograph on their phone or on a camera? And of course, at that point, everyone's hand is raised, and we realize that everyone has a copyright. And eyes light up, and light bulbs go off in people's heads and children's heads, and in their teachers' heads, quite frankly, about ways of thinking about how to have that conversation. So I think, when we talk about IP, a lot of times the education around AI is, I think, a similar conversation. It's how are we using it? How do people use it responsibly? To your point, what are those guardrails we're putting into place? So this is our starting point for this conversation. And I'm going to start here, Jamie, at the policy level. We know that the conversation can be tenuous, right? It can be polarized, especially these days. So I'd love to know from your perception, what you've seen, what are some of the biggest misconceptions or persistent misconceptions that you've seen shaping these conversations?
Well, thank you. And that is a great question. And it's actually a very broad topic. So we're pretty frequently talking to generalists who don't necessarily have a background in IP. But I'll focus, I guess, to start with maybe picking up a little bit on the last panel. And there was a discussion of injunctions in the big Supreme Court case in 2006 that basically eliminated injunctions as being an automatic remedy for patent infringement. And this kind of happened during a time when there was a very dominant narrative around Congress and elsewhere that there were these problematic entities, pejoratively called patent trolls, that were suing everybody unfairly and extracting money that should have gone to research and development. And as I'm saying it now, I think you can understand that that's a very compelling narrative, but it's built on a lot of misconceptions and bad facts. And I think in hindsight, some of what became apparent is this is at the same time that you had the rise of companies whose business model was actually aggregating inventions into things we might know as a smartphone. A smartphone is a phone, and now it's also a camera, and it has a lot of inventions in it. So in some ways, it's not surprising that those companies and other ones similar to that were at the receiving end of a lot of patent lawsuits. And anyone who's on the receiving end of a patent lawsuit tends to think the patent that they're facing is bad. It isn't a real invention, or it's an invention that they made. So a little bit of that is in the eye of the beholder. But of course, you can always find patents that that shouldn't have been issued. So one of the things we did as an organization at C4IP is we commissioned a study to look at patent quality. And the study looked actually kind of at a series of other studies to come up with kind of a meta study, if you will, to show that actually patent quality in the US is pretty good, better than our counterparts in comparative countries like China, EU, UK, Korea, Japan, that we actually have a pretty robust patent system with relatively low error rate. And if anything, the error rate is skewed in that the Patent Office rejects more claims that it should issue than allows claims that it shouldn't issue, which is a source of error you actually don't hear people talk about. But these are inventors who don't get their patent, basically, and that is a major source of error as well. But the bottom line is that that this became a very prominent narrative, and I think drove a lot of policy both on the Hill and before the courts. And it was based on, at bottom, kind of a faulty narrative, but it's one that's persisted. And then I'll just talk briefly about one other one, but just to kind of give you a sense of these different narratives and how they develop. One that, again, I can see how people would have this conception is that there's an idea that there should be a one-to-one correlation between a product and a patent. So if you have a drug, you have one patent. But to kind of take a step back from that example, I saw some papers that showed that if you look at a golf ball, that can be covered by something like 60 patents. So there's a lot of inventions that go into what may be a single product. Again, going to kind of the smartphone example, that's a little easier to see because you can physically see how there might be a camera and there's wireless components, and there's a lot of things going into that. And even though you can't see the molecules in a drug, you can break it down in the same way that a drug, actually a single drug product, has the active ingredient. It has the way that you formulate it so you can take it safely. You have to know what drug it treats, and those are all separate inventions. So you frequently hear skepticism that one product should have a lot of patents covering it. But if you're a patent practitioner, that's not a surprise. It actually just reflects that a lot of innovation went into what a consumer might see as a single product, not an abuse of the system, but sometimes it's framed as an abuse when I don't think it should be.
Thank you for that. And that's interesting about this idea of that abuse. And I think that is a perception that we hear more and more. And it's an oversimplification in a way. And so, Corey, I'll come to you. How would you respond to this criticism that these days maybe IP is being portrayed as protecting profits over people more than the other way around? And what happens when we oversimplify?
Sorry, what was it?
When we oversimplify.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's a huge oversimplification. So when I talk about this, I like to take a step back, and when I'm doing slides, I actually usually have a picture of a clownfish in front of its natural background, which is a sea anemone, if you don't know. And I ask people what they see, and of course, everybody says Nemo, which shows you the power of IP in one sense, right? No, but everyone focuses on the clownfish, in the picture because it's bright and colorful and cute and all that. And really, I don't think anyone has ever pointed out the fact that there's a sea anemone in the background. And I'm obviously going somewhere with this, but bear with me for a minute. So, and it turns out that the clownfish in that scenario actually does benefit from the background of the environment it's in. The sea anemone provides the poison tentacles, protects the clownfish from its main predators. But what people don't see, in that picture is the reverse is actually true, many times over. So it's actually the sea anemone is providing is getting all kinds of benefits from the clownfish as well. So it's getting the smaller fish that get attracted by the clownfish actually get eaten by the sea anemone. The butterfly fish is the main predator of the sea anemone that gets chased away. The favorable water flow is created. So all these other benefits happen, right? So of course, what I'm talking about here in nature is symbiosis. It's that each benefits the other. And that is exactly the way for people who is, talking about the education, how do you explain this to people? What people don't see when they're focusing on the benefits that come through the patent system to inventors, in our space or any other, they're not thinking about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, of course, everyone in this room, I think, or most of you understand IP, but there is the innovation itself that gets inspired by the patent system. There is access to the innovation, which I'll talk about in a minute, specific to pharmaceuticals. There's the economic growth that comes from, if you use your IP to start a company, to build a business, which becomes an industry, which brings in jobs, tax revenue. These days, we're talking about supply chain security, national security coming from all these things, being at home. All of that is driven by IP. So I think, it's a question of stepping back, kind of like the picture image. It works a little better when I have the slide, but you get the point. When you actually change your focus, you realize that this is all, and James Madison, of course, talked about this, a public good fully coinciding with the individuals and all that at the time of the Constitution. In the pharma space, to answer your question more specifically, starting with the innovation piece, I think most people, we in industry circles talk about this a lot, but most of the public doesn't, I think, realize just what it takes to invent new drugs. The average costs are something like $2.6 billion per drug. It takes 10 to 15 years or so on average to take a drug from the lab to the clinic and get it approved. The failure rate is still just stubborn and stunning. It's about 88% failure rate when you start clinical trials. So that's after you've already invented a new drug, which later on we can talk about maybe some of the AI implications of that. But when people say, oh, AI will spit out a new molecule, that's only the beginning of a very long journey and where all the investment usually comes later. There's all these costs involved, all these failures involved. And the other statistic that is often not published either is that only about 20 to 30% of drugs make any money. Just like any other industry, you look at movies, right? I mean, everyone focuses on, a big blockbuster film. Ooh, the movie industry must make all this money and directors make all this money. Well, it depends. Sure, if you have a blockbuster, you're going to make the money, but not everyone does. We have the same dynamic in our industry. And when you add all that up, I mean, what the patent system basically does, it enables, I don't think of it as a reward for innovation, it's an enabler of innovation. Without it, you simply cannot make the level of investments and endure the level of risk that's needed to invent new drugs. No one would put their money into that. And that's how the model works. So that's the innovation piece. And one more quick fact on that. I mean, if you know the history of the industry, believe it or not, it's only about 150 years old. We had no pharmaceutical industry, just a century and a half ago. We were still practicing 2,000-year-old theory of the humors and leeches and things like that. So all the modern medicines came starting in the, mid to late 1800s. And I've looked back myself, there are patents behind every single medicine, even the earliest ones in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It was always the driver behind the industry and still is to this day. The access piece is often also misunderstood. So thinking again about the big picture, we're not just talking about you need the patents to get the innovation. The patents also drive access both in the short term and the long term, which is very much underappreciated. In the short term, even after you have a medicine, the investments that it takes to actually launch them in any given country, including the United States, are vast. So you have to first invest in often local clinical trials in many countries where you want to launch, like in China and several others. You can't just launch the drug. You have to do local clinical trials there as well. So that's an expense. You have to file for regulatory approval country by country. You have to educate doctors and patients about the existence of a drug, which they don't often know. We often invest in the diagnosis of the disease that the drug treats. We have a gene therapy that treats a disease called spinal muscular atrophy among infants. We invested heavily in states across the country to make sure that infants are tested for this genetic disorder early on because the drug only works in the first 6 months of life. Otherwise, it doesn't work. There's building distribution chains, building factories to manufacture. If you don't actually make those investments, the drug doesn't get launched, and having the IP right enables you to do that. Generics don't do that work. And then on the longer term, of course, people often forget also that even though about 90-something% of drugs today in the US are generic, every single one of those cheaper, lower cost generic drugs began its life as a patented pharmaceutical. So they're able to get it cheaper because they're not doing the research. They're just following your successes. So today's patented drugs are tomorrow's generic. So you have to look at the value return there. And then I'll stop in one more minute, but there are other pieces really quick. Collaboration, right? Without the IP, this was talked about earlier today. You're not going to bring partners together, different innovators that have more than one idea to bring to the table, more than one asset to bring to the table. You need IP to bring that together, and also competition. Best example of that today is GLP-1s, right? It's not one company selling GLP-1s. It's Novo and Eli Lilly going head to head almost every day. You see some new version that's being, improving on the last. That also is driven by the competition that's created by IP. If you didn't have IP, you'd probably have one innovator and 100 generics, and it would never get any better. So that's just a snapshot of all the different, I think, pieces of the value chain that people don't see when they say, oh, you're making money from making this drug.
Thank you for that. I promised to cite you when I use that clownfish anemone story now, because that's fantastic. We talk the innovation economy, right? Is this really interesting thing, and we talk about it a lot here. Ohio, those of you who aren't from Ohio, our governor likes to refer to us now as the Silicon Heartland, because of the. We'll give her a minute to talk. You could stop at the box office for details if you'd like. I'll go on in a minute. It's all right. Thank you. We are at a museum, and we have to tell people to leave, otherwise they wouldn't. So it's important to think about this. So innovation economy, again, our governor likes to refer to Ohio as a Silicon Heartland. And Columbus is a burgeoning startup city. We have a thing here called Ohio X, which is a growing community of startups and entrepreneurs, especially in the tech field, especially in the AI space. Ohio has been an early adopter of a number of initiatives around AI. And so it's great to talk about that. But if we have an innovation economy, we don't have an innovation education. I recently did a short video, actually, a vlog, if you will, on the strategic risk of not having an innovation education program, because at this point, we have companies who choose not to do business in Ohio because they worry they won't have the staff. They won't be able to retain or attract the talent to have those jobs. So Arlyne, I'll come to you because we're a little bit in the same space here, and I'll plug for Arlyne. If any of you are going to be here tomorrow morning in Columbus, she will be doing a reading of Abby Invents for our Earth Day celebration tomorrow. We're really grateful for you to come do that. So we're excited. Thank you. But because we often talk about IP awareness, and that's really not enough. We need to talk about IP and AI literacy, really. And so what does that look like? What does IP literacy or IP empowerment look like, especially when we're talking to younger people? And again, to counteract, I should say, this perception that IP is too abstract or not for me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Awareness is very passive. You can be aware that inventions are all around you. You can be aware inventors exist. But really, what is the catalyst that makes you move from inventors exist to I can be an inventor? That sense of belonging or developing an inventor identity. And so that's where my Abby Invents books comes in, sort of bridging that gap. Books, I think, are mirrors. When you read a book and you see images that look like you feel affirmed. Books are windows. It gives you a peek into people's lives who are different from you, a peek into pain points that you may never have thought about before. And it allows kids to develop a sense of empathy. We're talking a lot about AI today. And I think one of the early speakers mentioned that, we can't forget humans being part of the equation. And so one thing that really separates us from AI is our empathy. And books are one means to sort of hone that skill set in kids. So put that together, then books become a door of opportunity. And when I write books or when I enter classrooms, I think of three things. How can I make inventing simple? How can I make it fun? And how can I make it relevant? And so in Abby Invents, the first story, I sort of, in both storybooks, I center Black and brown characters as inventors, characters that are usually relegated to the sidelines. And in Abby Invents Unbreakable Crayons, you have a little girl who's tired of her crayons breaking, so she invents the world's first unbreakable crayons, and she gets her first patent. In the second title, Abby Invents the Foldybot, she's playing with her cousin. It's empathy. She's seeing her mom taking forever to fold laundry. She knows there's washing machines to wash the clothes, dryers to dry the clothes, where are the folding machines to fold the clothes. And she earns her second patent. And so for me, it's so beautiful to see kids immediately grasp what inventing is, what a patent is. The vocabulary becomes action-driven because now they're like, oh my gosh, wait, she looks like me. Is this invention real? Wait, my crayons are always breaking. Can I make unbreakable crayons? And so that sort of immediately drives a discourse in what is a patent? How could I get a patent? The challenge I feel like we as adults or grown-ups, so to speak, what we do is we assume that kids are not able to understand these things because we make IP so complex and we unintentionally gatekeep IP. As a personal anecdote, I became an inventor when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, invented a blood test that detects when cancer patients are rejecting bone marrow transplants. And as a student, I felt that through undergrad and grad school, there weren't many mandatory courses that told you that mandatory courses on IP. It's sort of you stumble into it. And so when I was inventing in grad school, in my mind, it was publish or perish. And so I was fixated on getting a publication, not really getting IP. And so to me, it's sort of alarming that after all these decades of going to school that you still don't have the the knowledge or wisdom on how do you file a patent and having to navigate the tech transfer office, and it still feels like a black box. So that really was the catalyst for writing these stories, and I think we owe it to ourselves to sort of have those conversations to kids. You know, I love the picture you painted of Nemo and the anemone. I'm personally going to try using that too. So
Now in the public domain.
yeah, copyrighted by you. Being able to just show kids, you know, inventions all around us and making them see the different use cases of IP, I think that's really valuable.
I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I think about that. And, you know, today we've talked a lot about patents and marketability and commercialization, and you know, what is it worth? And you know, to your point, it's easy to be jaded as adults, as folks who've gone through processes or are, you know, patent owners or have gone through the business piece of it. And at some point, it's kind of like with education: is there education for education's sake or art for art's sake? Are there patents for patent's sake? Yes, it's an expensive process, and maybe that aside, when we talk to young people, it is about making sure that they know that their ideas are powerful and that they are empowered to protect what's theirs. And I think that's, to your point, that's a really critical piece of it, and why we work closely with local IP firms, attorneys, and folks who are very interested in also helping us promote that with young people, because it is expensive to get a patent. So we work with attorneys who are willing to do pro bono work for the young people that we work with, who have an idea that they say, yes, we'll help you do the prior art search. We'll help you learn the process so that you can protect your work. And young people get it. I will just, if you haven't talked to a middle schooler lately, it's an education in itself. They speak a whole other language, literally. But they get it. Tell a 13-year-old girl that someone can take her diary and publish it. And yeah, right. And not get credit, not give her credit for it. All of the young women in your life who are Swifties, they all know about IP, and they can tell you exactly why it works and how it works based on what happened to Taylor Swift and her, you know, travails with her work. So we are ripe right now. I mean, I have to tell you, the atmosphere right now is absolutely ripe to have this conversation with young people. And someone was talking about the power of the future and having faith in the upcoming generations and thinking about who's going to champion things on the Hill and so forth. I will tell you, because I work mostly with young people, I am very optimistic. Whether the system stays the same or the system is adjusted, that remains to be seen. But the system will remain in some form, because young people care deeply about equity, and they care very much about personal rights. So before we go to our closing moment here, are there any questions?
Yeah, just building on that. Like, young people also care a lot about like sustainability and bias. And you know, my daughter is 14. She's like, I don't want to use AI because of the data centers and the water that it uses and the environmental impact. And I was reading something about indigenous groups and the land that's taken. That, you know, there's a lot going on there to build these data centers. So what about grappling with that? Like, not so much an understanding of IP and valuing IP, but also like the AI, dealing with this resistance to adopting AI because of concerns that might be more with the younger generation that like the older generation or the corporate side might not fully appreciate?
100%. I love that question. We actually are working with some young people right now whose their teachers have a design challenge for them to create a more sustainable data center. Because here in the Central Ohio area, this is a huge question right now, because they're building them like, I don't know, they're going up like Walmart's. They're all over. And yeah, again, young people are native to this. We used this term earlier. They're native to the technology. So the technology itself is not new to them. They may not have the vocabulary to talk about it, but they do see the sustainability issue, and they are very concerned. And so I know some colleagues who are working with young people on design challenges to come up with a more, you know, environmentally friendly data center. And I keep telling her, please make sure you are working on those kids, you know, IP if they come up with something that needs to go out in public, because they will. I have I have absolute faith that they will.
Just to add to that, I mean, with all technology, right? I mean, this is a great example of how technology can really continue to solve the problems that technology creates. It's not just about efficiency, and it's great that people care about that question, but it's also going to be economically more efficient if you can run AI on less energy, right? So you see this, of course, happen in the chip sector, where chips become more and more powerful. They need to find ways to cool off and use less energy. We see it really in every field. And to me, the answer, it's kind of cliche, but the answer, is almost always technology. And that brings you right back around to why we need IP and why we need to invest in the innovation to keep improving our processes and making them better.
Sarah, we have a question.
So I'm thoroughly convinced you're doing an amazing job, and kids are going to be open to this. But as we discussed last night, I think the barrier to entry is teaching the teachers how to bring this to the students. And changing the paradigm of established people in education everywhere is really challenging. How do you feel, or how can you break through that barrier so that you can get that good information to the students?
Yeah, and I'll give time for my colleagues to respond. But from my own personal experience, so my background is in education. I was a high school teacher for about a decade. I was a high school principal for another decade before going into informal education and finally winding up here at this great institution for the last 4 years. And I will tell you that educators want to do this work. They want to do this work, but there's a policy issue. And so to work with teachers, I actually think we have to work with policymakers and superintendents and school boards first. This conversation to a lot of folks comes off as a nice to have. Oh, that would be fluffy, or that would be a lovely thing if we had more money, or this is great for the private school down the street, or the well-resourced suburban school. But what we don't have is the conversation that this is critical. It's mission critical. We do a lot of work with workforce here at COSI and workforce development, because those are the conversations we want to be having. And that's who thankfully our government is listening to, our workforce folks. So if I can have someone at Anduril, for example, which just built a nice big facility here, or folks who are in the workforce space tell our policy folks, we need critical thinkers. And we need young people who will understand innovation and have an innovation mindset, then that trickles down to superintendents and principals talking to teachers about, hey, how are we measuring innovation mindset in the classrooms? Because if it's not measured, it doesn't happen. So those are the conversations, because the teachers want to do this. We're hosting several professional developments this summer with teachers around that. So there's another question over here, and I want to make sure that we have another response up here, and then we'll get to that question. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, just a quick response to answer your question about educators. So many times you may know that educators they use their own money to buy supplies for students. And they also sometimes use their own money to attend professional development workshops. And so there are quite a few professional development workshops that sort of have educators learning about IP. And there's a whole gamut of educators who are very passionate about invention education. They like it because it's very student-led. And so they give students prompts to come up with invention challenges. And so that way the educators themselves, they don't have to be experts in IP. Similar to what you saw Dr. B showed earlier, where he has, videos that educators can learn about IP, patent, copyright, trademarks. There's lots of invention competitions around the US and even in schools that really allow educators to sort of just let the students be free, identify a problem that you want to solve in your home, your school, your community, the world. And that allows the students themselves to sort of learn the art of inventing by doing, and learning about the different types of IP.
Yeah, it's a comment. So there's a really interesting, powerful community called Invent Ed, and they're doing it's assisted or sponsored by Lemslin MIT, and it's all high school educators who are really interested in bringing invention education and IP education to students. I was at their conference a few years ago, and one of the things that I'll echo Arlyne. they were really excited about the opportunity to make education, other education like physics or engineering, more culturally relevant, because they could say, here's a problem, we want to solve it, we have to figure out we need to figure out these engineering concepts or these physics concepts in order to invent the thing that will solve that problem. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out.
She's not a plant, I promise. But on October 12th, we are co-hosting an InventEd summit called Invent Ohio to bring together all of these various environments, industry, funders, policymakers, educators to have that conversation. And it is a great segue into our wrap up here this afternoon, which is I'm going to ask my wonderful esteemed colleagues here to talk about one concrete way that we and all of you can better connect classrooms, industry, policy, universities, so that learners see IP and frankly AI as not as abstract, but as a real world tool that they can use.
Thanks. Well, I've found when I'm talking to people, I feel like one of the best things you can do is have a concrete example that allows you to pull together a lot of these concepts. I feel like a lot of the speakers today have done a great job doing that. And I feel like that breaks through, as someone else recently mentioned, there's a lot of jargon in the IP space, but the concepts themselves, I think, are fairly common sense if you get past all of the verbiage. And sometimes a concrete example can do that and be very helpful.
I guess I'd say, IP is so pervasive that we forget it's there. It's in absolutely everything that we teach now, and you don't need a new platform, and you don't need a day or a section or a semester on IP to teach it. So some really quick examples, right? When you're teaching your unit to kindergartners, or maybe maybe they're a little young, but when you're talking about the Constitution, whenever that happens in school, right? There's the progress clause, right? Spend 5 minutes talking about how this is one of the first, one of the enumerated powers that went to Congress, and it was the third thing that the very first Congress passed, and that it is actually the only right given to individuals in the entire Constitution before in the body, before the Bill of Rights, right? And Bill of Rights written by Madison, right? Who also wrote that. When you're teaching Mark Twain, right? Everyone talks about Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer. What they don't teach is that his actually most profitable book was Blank. It was a patented scrapbook. He sold 25,000 copies, patented in 1897, and made more money from that than any of his books combined, and was able to be an author because of that. Blue jeans have a patent story behind it. Absolutely everything that you look at, teach, talk about in school could have an IP component. And I think that is the way to kind of ingrain it rather than trying to fight and find room in the curriculum for a whole dedicated IP chapter.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Another way that you can introduce kids to, the concept of IP is just introducing them to real life role models. So whenever I enter the classroom, usually I'll introduce the students to inventors like Dr. Rosaline Rosario Melendez, who invented Superstay Matte, the long-lasting lipstick by L'Oreal. I'll wear the lipstick and I'll talk to the kids about the problem that she was trying to solve. Or you introduce kids to inventors like Dr. Marion Croak, who invented voice over IP. Many of the kids today, they went through the pandemic, and you can explain to them like, hey, do you know how we were able to communicate through Zoom and FaceTime? Basically making science and inventing relevant and introducing them to kid inventors. Like there's a teenager, Ella Casano, who invented the Medi-Teddy. She was ill, and whenever she went to the hospital, she got scared because she saw, these IV bags giving her all these drugs. And so her invention is a plush teddy that is covering the IV bag, so no child has to look at the bag that's giving you the drug. So basically showing kids, inventing is all about identifying a problem, coming up with a solution, and making it plain, simple, relevant to their lives, and showing them people who look like them, who actually invent, is something that we can do.
Great. That was a fantastic finale. I thank you all. Sara, Jamie, Corey, Arlyne. Thank you.